Picture walking into a cave, torch in hand, knowing something inside could kill you in 3 seconds, and going in anyway. Not by accident, on purpose, every single winter. That wasn't bravery, that was survival math. And the animal on the other side of that math weighed nearly a ton, stood taller than a doorway on its hind legs, and lived in the exact caves your ancestors needed for shelter. The cave bear. You've probably never heard of it, which is strange considering it may be the single most feared animal in early human history. Not the lion, not the wolf. A bear the size of a small car, with claws built for tearing through frozen ground, sharing the same shelters your ancestors were trying to survive winter in. Here's the part that should stop you. This wasn't a rare, occasional encounter. Caves across Europe, the same ones where early humans and Neanderthals sheltered, are packed with cave bear bones. Some sites contain the remains of hundreds of individual bears, layered over thousands of years of use. That's not a horror story. That's a shared address. Paleontologist Gennady Baryshnikov, who has spent decades studying cave bear remains across Eurasia, found bones bearing cut marks and fracture patterns consistent with human butchery at multiple sites. Not isolated incidents, but a recurring pattern stretching across tens of thousands of years. Somewhere along the way, the animal that could kill you in your sleep became a food source you deliberately sought out. Think about what that actually required. A cave bear could weigh up to twice as much as a modern grizzly. It hibernated through winter in the exact shelters early humans wanted for themselves. Which means every autumn, your ancestors faced a brutal choice. Find your own shelter from a freezing world with no guarantee of finding one at all, or take the shelter that already has a massive predator sleeping inside it. They chose the second option, repeatedly. And this is where the hunting strategy gets almost unbearably tense. A hibernating cave bear is not helpless. It's groggy, slower to react, but still capable of killing a person with a single swipe if it wakes at the wrong moment. So early hunters didn't rush in. They waited near the cave mouth, sometimes for days, reading the depth of the animal's sleep, timing their approach around the coldest, deepest part of winter when the bear's body had slowed the most. Archaeologist and cave art specialist Jean Clottes, who studied the painted caves of southern France including Chauvet, noted that cave bears appear repeatedly in the earliest known cave art, often rendered with more care and detail than any other animal, suggesting they held a symbolic weight far beyond simple prey. You don't paint an animal that carefully unless it terrifies you and commands your respect in equal measure. Now here's where it gets stranger. Cave bear skulls found deep inside painted caves are sometimes positioned deliberately, placed on stone ledges or arranged in patterns that couldn't have happened by accident. Nobody fully agrees on what this means, but the leading interpretation among researchers is unsettling in its own way. These weren't just meals. They were something closer to a ritual, a way of processing the fact that you had just killed something powerful enough to have killed you first. Biochemist Hervé Bocherens, who has spent years analyzing isotopes preserved in ancient bone to reconstruct prehistoric diets, found chemical signatures indicating that some Neanderthal groups consumed cave bear meat regularly enough for it to register clearly in their bone chemistry. Not as a rare, desperate meal, but as part of a repeated and intentional pattern. That tells you this wasn't a last resort. This was a strategy, refined over generations, targeting one of the most dangerous animals in their entire ecosystem. So why take that risk at all? Why not just hunt deer? Easier, smaller, far less likely to end your life in an instant. Because a cave bear wasn't just food. It was everything at once. Meat dense enough to last a family through the worst weeks of winter. A pelt thick enough to survive temperatures that would kill an unprotected human within hours. Fat reserves built up specifically for hibernation, which meant a cave bear killed in early winter carried more stored energy than almost any other animal available. And the cave itself, once emptied, became shelter. One successful hunt solved 4 survival problems simultaneously: food, warmth, fat, shelter. No other prey animal offered that combination. But the danger cut both ways, and this is the part rarely mentioned. Human skeletal remains from this period sometimes show injuries consistent with bear attacks, deep puncture wounds, crushed bones, healed fractures that suggest a person survived an encounter that easily could have killed them. These weren't hunters who got lucky every time. These were people who understood, on some level, that this particular hunt carried odds no other hunt did, and went anyway, because the alternative, a winter with no shelter and no fat reserves, carried odds that were worse. This changes how you should think about fear itself. Modern fear tells you to avoid the thing that scares you. Ancient fear worked differently. It told you exactly which risks were worth taking, because the alternative was a slower, quieter death that never gave you the chance to fight back. A cave bear was terrifying. Starvation was more terrifying. And that math, brutal as it sounds, shaped which animals your ancestors were willing to face directly. It also shaped something less obvious: reputation. In small, tightly knit groups where everyone depended on everyone else, the person willing to lead a cave bear hunt wasn't just brave. They were valuable in a way that rippled through the entire group's chances of survival. Anthropological studies of small-scale societies consistently find that individuals who took on the most dangerous, highest-stakes hunts often gained outsized social standing, not because the group admired recklessness, but because that willingness translated directly into food, shelter, and warmth for everyone else during the hardest months of the year. Facing the cave bear wasn't only about personal survival, it was a currency, traded for status, trust, and a stronger position within the group when resources ran thin. Consider the physical reality of what a cave bear encounter actually meant. This wasn't a lean predator built for speed. It was closer to a wall of muscle and bone, with a skull structure so dense that some specimens show healed fractures from fights with other bears, injuries that would have killed almost anything else outright. An animal that could survive that kind of trauma and keep living was not something a spear and a few hunters could casually overpower. Every successful hunt meant someone had studied this animal closely enough to know its weaknesses and had bet their life on that knowledge being correct. That knowledge didn't come cheap. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer knowledge transmission have long noted that skills involving dangerous megafauna were passed down with extraordinary care, often through direct mentorship rather than casual observation, because a single mistake meant a lesson nobody survived to repeat. You can imagine what those lessons looked like. Which way a bear's head would turn first if startled, how far its reach extended from a resting position, the exact sound its breathing made in the deepest phase of hibernation versus the lighter, more dangerous phase closer to waking. This was not general courage. This was applied expertise, refined generation after generation, because the cost of ignorance was absolute, and the timing mattered as much as the knowledge. Cave bears didn't hibernate uniformly. Early winter sleep was lighter, more easily disturbed. Midwinter sleep, when body temperature and metabolism dropped to their lowest point, offered the narrow window where a hunt carried the best odds of success. Miss that window in either direction, too early or too late, and the risk of the animal waking mid-attack rose sharply. This means the hunt wasn't a single decision. It was a calendar tracked across weeks, timed to a biological window that had to be read correctly, or the entire strategy collapsed into a fight nobody wanted. There's also the matter of what happened after a successful hunt, because a ton of bear meat doesn't preserve itself. Evidence from several European sites suggests early humans developed specific techniques for processing and storing bear fat separately from the meat, likely because the fat, richer and more calorie-dense, required different handling to avoid spoiling in the relatively milder temperatures near a cave entrance. This wasn't incidental knowledge. It was a whole secondary skill set built entirely around successfully exploiting one of the most dangerous animals available, and it had to be mastered just as thoroughly as the hunt itself, or the entire risk would have been for nothing. Compare this to smaller prey like deer or hare, which required speed and stealth, but rarely demanded this level of calculated risk or specialized aftercare. The cave bear sat in a category entirely of its own, an animal so valuable and so dangerous that it justified building an entire seasonal strategy around a single, narrow opportunity. Most animals in the ancient world offered a simple trade: effort for food. The cave bear offered something closer to a gamble, enormous reward balanced against the very real possibility that this particular hunt ended not with food, but with a body left in the snow. That captures this better than any single fact. Deep inside, alongside painted images of cave bears and lions, footprints belonging to a child were found preserved in the cave floor, walking alongside what appears to be the tracks of a large canine, likely a wolf or an early domesticated dog. Nobody knows the full story behind those footprints, but it tells you something important. These caves weren't sealed-off horror zones humans avoided at all costs. They were shared spaces, walked through, painted in, lived alongside the very animals that could end a life in seconds. That relationship, equal parts terror and necessity, is almost impossible to imagine now. You don't have to calculate whether tonight's shelter is worth risking your life for. You flip a switch and the room is warm. But for hundreds of thousands of years, that calculation was constant, and the animal at the center of it, the one painted with the most care, feared the most intensely, and still hunted anyway, was the cave bear. By roughly 24,000 years ago, the cave bear was extinct, likely pushed out by a combination of climate shifts that reduced the plants it depended on for most of its diet, and sustained pressure from the very species that had been hunting it and competing for its caves for millennia. Your ancestors outlasted an animal that could have killed any one of them without effort. Not through strength, through patience, timing, and a willingness to walk toward the one thing in their world that scared them most, because surviving the winter mattered more than surviving the fear. So the next time something in your life feels too dangerous to face directly, remember this. Somewhere in your ancestry, a person stood at the mouth of a dark cave, torch shaking slightly in their hand, knowing exactly what was sleeping inside, and walked in anyway. Not because they weren't afraid, because they'd already done the math and the fear lost.